Today I'm going to share two absolutely horrifying encounters with Sasquatch. But before we get into those encounters, welcome back to Dark Wilderness, where I share encounters with the unexplained. If you've had an encounter that you would like to share, please email me at the link below. And if you like today's stories, please gently slap that like button, as I'll be uploading multiple times every week. So don't forget to bring that subscribe button with you as you make your way down the highway, so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounters. This first encounter comes from Chris, and it happened late one Saturday night at the end of September in 1996. Chris was just your normal 17-year-old kid. He had a part-time job, and his part-time job was working at a movie theater in Winnipeg. Chris himself, though, he did not live in Winnipeg. He lived out in St. Rita, which is located about 45 minutes east of Winnipeg down Highway 15. This particular night, Chris was actually closing the theater down, so he did not get out of work till about 1:30 in the morning. So when he got off of work, he went outside, got into his car. He was driving a 1979 Camaro at the time, got in it, and started making his way home. By the time Chris drove through the city and actually got to Highway 15, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. So he's making his way down Highway 15. He passes through the town of Dugald, then Enola, and by the time he got to Vivian, he realized he was the only vehicle on the road. He had nobody behind him, nobody up in front of him, but that was completely normal for this part of the drive. The only two towns with any real substantial population along Highway 15 are Dugald and Enola. After that, the towns are kind of become more just like communities of houses. No gas stations, no stores or anything like that. So it's very, very common for him at this point of his drive to have nobody else on the highway with him. So he just kept driving down the highway. When he was about 2.5 miles from St. Rita, his car started running super rough, and he actually looked down and noticed that it was starting to overheat. So he pulled it over to the side of the road, turned it off, and he sat there for a couple of minutes with the vehicle off. He went to start it again, but the car just would not start. So at this point, he was really faced with one of two choices. He can either walk that 2.5 miles home, or he could just wait in the vehicle, hope somebody drove by, flag them down, and hopefully hitch a ride. He decided, though, because it's only 2.5 miles, he was just going to walk the rest of the way home. So he reached into his glove box, grabbed a mini mag light, got out, and he started making his way down the shoulder of the highway towards St. Rita. He walked for about 1.5 miles, and he noticed up ahead of him, in the middle of the road looked wet. He could see a little bit of a reflection from the moon on what looked like this dark liquid right in the middle of the highway. So he pulled out his mag light, shone it towards this dark-looking liquid on the ground, and he noticed that it was just an absolutely massive blood smear going from the middle of the highway, cross through the shoulder, and into the ditch. His first thought, though, was that this was from a deer. There's a lot of deer in the area. They're always getting hit by cars. So that was his first thought, was that a deer got hit by a car and it dragged itself into the ditch. He walked a few more feet, and he was still had his light down, looking at the blood on the ground. And he noticed something that was a little bit odd. He did not see skid marks from tires. He did not see broken glass or any parts of a broken vehicle. Nothing like that. So he's kind of stopped for a second, kind of looking at the blood on the ground, trying to figure out exactly what this blood's from, because it was obviously not hit by a car, or if it was, this car just kept going, didn't make any attempt to stop. So as he's investigating this blood smear on the highway, he hears in the ditch behind him what sounds like crunching bone. So he quickly whips his flashlight around, shines it into the ditch, and what he sees in the tall grass, hunched over the body of this deer, was this massive dark figure. So he's standing there with his flashlight shining on this thing, kind of trying to figure out what he's looking at, and then all of a sudden this thing stands up. And what he described as standing up in front of him was this 10-foot tall Sasquatch. But what he noticed the most about this thing was, because he had his flashlight shining right on it, was that its face, its chest, and its arms were completely covered in blood from this deer. At that moment, Chris noticed that that sound of crunching bone was not the sound of this thing actually eating that deer, but rather the sound of this thing ripping one of the hindquarters right off. This Sasquatch was standing in front of him, completely covered in blood, holding a deer's hindquarter in its left hand. Chris just stood there staring at this thing, and this thing just kept staring right back at him. He said that this thing, when it was staring back at him, He said he was just fixated on the eyes. He said that its eyes were glowing red, and he said it just felt like these eyes were just piercing right through him. He does not remember freezing, and he also does not remember starting to run. He said before he knew it, he was just barreling down the highway for home. The entire time while he was running the rest of the way home, he kept having the feeling that this Sasquatch was going to come barreling out of the bush, grab him, and he would never be seen again. When he got home, he went inside. He did not wake anybody up. He just went straight to his room and he tried to get some sleep. He could not sleep at all that night, though, because of this encounter that he just had. And he said that he kept hearing weird noises outside of his house, but he thought that those noises were more than likely normal, and he was just making a bigger deal about them because of his encounter. However, at about 7 o'clock in the morning, his dad actually came into his room because his dad looked outside, did not see his car there, so he went to go check on his son. So as soon as he opened that door and saw Chris lying on his bed, the first thing he asked him was, "Where's your car?" Chris told him that his car had died on the side of the road and that he had to actually walk the rest of the way home. He did not tell his dad about his encounter with the Sasquatch at this point, though. And his dad said, "Kate, let's get in the truck. We're going to go see if you can get your car going." So Chris and his dad made their way outside, and as soon as Chris stepped outside, he saw on the side of his dad's truck this massive blood smear that went from the tailgate all the way up to the front of the hood. His dad instantly freaked out and asked Chris if he knew who did that. Chris at this point, though, was absolutely horrified. He said he was more scared in this moment than he was when he was staring at that Sasquatch, because in that exact moment, he knew that indeed this Sasquatch had been following him down the highway, and even worse, it followed him all the way home, and it knows where he lives now. So Chris, without responding to his dad, he turned around and ran inside the house. His dad followed him in, kept yelling at him, asking him, "Who did this to my truck?" And then Chris told his dad this whole story. And remarkably, Chris said that his dad actually believed him. His dad actually had an encounter with a Sasquatch when he was just a kid. So when Chris was telling him exactly what had happened to him that night, his dad was not ridiculing him or saying that he was making this up. His dad was believing every single thing that Chris was telling him. Now, Chris's advice is, if you're ever driving down the highway at night and your vehicle dies, he said, just stay in the car. He said, don't try walking if you do not have to. He said, wait for somebody to come. He said, obviously, if your vehicle's dead and it's like 30 below and you're going to freeze, then yeah, you have no choice but to walk. He said, but if you have a choice, he said, always just pick the safety of the vehicle and try not to go out anywhere on foot. This encounter comes from Thomas, and it happened in 2010 while he was out at CFB Gagetown training with the Canadian Forces. CFB Gagetown's located in New Brunswick, just outside the town of Oromocto, which is located just southeast of Fredericton. It's an absolutely massive base. It's actually the largest in all of the Commonwealth. It's so big that on the one side of the base, they actually have another camp because the area is so incredibly huge that to travel from one side of the base to the other and back takes pretty much all day. So they've actually built another camp on the far side. So any troops training on that side of the base could just stay at that camp and they don't have to come all the way back to the main base itself. It's a base that I myself am very familiar with. I did my combat engineer training there in 2008, so I'm very familiar with Gagetown and the surrounding areas. Now, Thomas was out there doing training, and they had a weekend off. And most guys out there, when they get a weekend off, they don't like to just confine themselves to base, because when you're on training, you tend to get confined to base for the first portion of training, and then as you kind of earn your way into getting time off, you'll start to be allowed to leave the base. So a lot of guys will actually go into Fredericton because it's not too far away. However, on a weekend, Fredericton can get super busy with military personnel that have the weekend off. Thomas and his three buddies decided instead of going into Fredericton, they were going to go into St. John's, which is located southeast of Gagetown. Not as many people go down to St. John's when they have a weekend off because it's a lot further than going into Fredericton. So they figured if they went to St. John's, there'd be less military guys around, less chance of running into course staff, and they'd just be able to unwind, kind of let loose a little bit more. So the four of them loaded up into his buddy's car and they made the drive down into St. John's. Now, they only had Friday night and Saturday off. They actually had to be back on base for 05:30, which is 5:30 in the morning, on Sunday. So they drove to St. John's, spent Friday night kind of partying. Saturday, they spent kind of wandering around town, kind of taking in different sites. Saturday night again, though, they went out for a little while. And at about 1 o'clock in the morning, they decided, Kate, that's it. We got to start making our way back to base. So they loaded up in their buddy's car and they started driving back towards Gagetown. Now, it's only about an hour and a half drive from St. John's to Gagetown. But when they were about halfway down that drive, the driver, who was actually the DD, was feeling pretty tired. So he found a spot on the side of the highway. He pulled off, right off onto the shoulder, kind of into the ditch a little bit, turned the car off and told him that, you know what, he just needs to get about 45 minutes worth of sleep and then he'd be good and they'd be able to keep going. Thomas and the other guys thought that was a great idea. They could use a little bit of rest themselves, so they kind of slumped back into their seats. Thomas was sitting up in the front. He was sitting shotgun, and he actually had his window rolled down a little bit. And about 5 minutes after they stopped, he started to hear this whooping sound coming from the really thick woods off beside their car. One of the guys in the back, he had also heard this sound, and he was pretty intoxicated. So in true goofy military fashion, he rolled his window down, leaned out the window, and started mimicking the sound back into the woods. Every time he would make this sound, that sound would come back from the woods back towards the car. After a few minutes of kind of goofing around and laughing about it, his buddy rolled the window up, leaned back in his seat, and within a couple of minutes, everybody in the car was asleep. Shortly after, Thomas was woken up by the sound of what sounded like rocks hitting the window right beside his head. So he kind of turned and looked outside, but he couldn't see anything. It was nothing but just pitch black and woods right beside the car. So he sat there for a couple minutes just listening to these rocks hit the window, hit the side of the car, and eventually he just reached over to his buddy, shook him awake, and said, "Hey man, somebody's throwing rocks at your car." That ticked his buddy off, so his buddy got up, opened the door, got out, and he stood there and just looked directly into the woods. He heard the rocks hitting his car too, so at the top of his lungs, he just yelled into the woods, "Screw off or you're getting your ass kicked." Then he got back in the car, closed the door, looked right over at Thomas, said, "Man, I just need about 15 more minutes. If you hear those rocks again, let me know when it's going to be on." Then he leaned back in his chair, almost instantly fell asleep, and same with Thomas. Again, a couple minutes later, Thomas heard the rocks hitting the window, hitting the side of the car. So he reached over to his buddy, shook him awake, and said, "Dude, they're throwing rocks again." Now his buddy was super mad because he's already yelled at whoever was throwing these rocks. So he opened the door, got out, and he just beelined directly to the trees, just screaming, "I'm going to get you." All the other guys in the car at this point were awake because they heard the driver screaming as he was running into the woods. So they're all kind of sitting in the car looking around, trying to figure out, like, why did he just run into the woods? Like, why did we not just leave? About 30 seconds later, they hear this absolute guttural scream come from inside the woods, followed directly by the terrified scream of their buddy. So now all three guys are inside the car and they're just staring out the window looking towards the forest, trying to figure out, one, what made that first scream, and also trying to figure out where's their buddy. They were expecting to see him just come barreling out of the bush at any second. A few seconds later, sure enough, their buddy comes barreling out of the trees, running directly towards the car, and right behind him, they see this absolutely monstrous silhouette chasing him. Their buddy runs straight towards the car, gets up to the driver's side door, opens it, jumps in. He's screaming, fumbling with his keys, trying to start the car. The other three guys, they're kind of scanning the area, kind of trying to figure out what this thing was that was chasing their buddy. As soon as the driver got the key into the ignition and went to start the car, they felt the back end of the car actually rise up off the ground a little bit. It felt like all of a sudden there was a big weight in the vehicle that was just lifted out and the back end just kind of lifted up a little bit. The driver, once the vehicle was started, put it into gear and floored it. but the car was not going anywhere. The front of the car was moving a little bit. They could hear the tires spinning, but the car was just not going forward. So Thomas and the other two passengers, they're staring out the back window, screaming, trying to figure out what this thing is, but they cannot get a good look at it because there just was not enough light. However, the driver kept cranking the wheel left and right, trying to get a little bit of traction so that the car could take off. After a few seconds, the back of the car dropped to the ground. The car took off, but because the driver was frantically moving the wheel left and right, it ended up veering further into the ditch. So the driver had to crank the wheel to the left, which brought the car back up out of the ditch onto the road. But right when they hit the gravel shoulder, the car kind of swung to the side a little bit, and now the headlights were shining directly towards where they had just been parked. And Thomas said what was standing right where they were was this massive 10-foot tall Sasquatch that he describes as having a very condylar shaped head, massively broad muscular shoulders, long arms, thick muscular legs, and this thing was just staring directly at the car. After about a second, this Sasquatch that they're staring at in front of them just started to charge directly towards the vehicle. The driver quickly put it in reverse, floored it, cranked the wheel, swung the car around, put it in gear, and floored it and took off. When they got back to base, they checked out the back of the car, and the majority of the bumper was completely gone. All the fiberglass had been smashed out, and one of their core staff that next morning actually noticed all that damage on the back of the car and asked them what happened. They ended up telling him that they had just backed into something and that it was no big deal, that they could get the car fixed. However, later in the morning, they were kind of off in this little smoking area. They had a little bit of a break, and they were telling one of their buddies about what exactly happened to them. And that same core staff member, which was a sergeant, overheard this, came over and ended up pulling all four guys aside and ended up telling them that if they did not want to get discharged from the military for being crazy, that they would just stop talking about it, not mention it to anybody else, and just kind of pretend that it never happened. But this sergeant also told them that he has heard stories of these things in that area before, but said just don't talk about it if they want to remain in the military. Now, Thomas's advice is if you're ever out in the woods and you hear a whooping sound, he said do not mimic it. He said it does not matter how tough you think you are or how many buddies you have with you and how tough you think they are. He said you do not want to mess with one of these Sasquatches when they're pissed off. He said so just don't mimic them and don't taunt them. Well, that's it for today's encounters. I've heard quite a few stories in the past actually about military members having experiences not only with Sasquatches but with like UFOs or other cryptids. And when they brought it to their superiors basically telling them the same thing that this sergeant told Thomas. But as always, if you have any comments, please leave them in the comments below. And if you haven't done so already, please bring that subscribe button with you as you make your way down the highway. And I'll see you next time.